Ruth Eleanor Caldwell had spent 47 years believing that a good woman's greatest asset was her silence. Not the silence of weakness, but the silence of someone who understood that peace in a household was worth more than being right in an argument. She had kept that silence through decades of small humiliations, through condescension disguised as affection, through being managed and redirected and quietly erased from decisions that affected her own life. She had kept it so long and so faithfully that by the time she was 75 years old, she had nearly forgotten she'd ever had a voice worth using. That was about to change. The morning it all ended began like hundreds of mornings before it. Ruth woke at 6, made coffee in the kitchen of the house on Sycamore Drive where she had lived for 31 years, and sat at the table by the window watching the light come through the old oak tree in the backyard. The tree had been a sapling when she and her late husband Franklin had moved in. Now its trunk was wider than she could wrap her arms around, and its branches sheltered the entire back garden. She'd always thought of that tree as a kind of testimony, something that proved that patient, quiet growth could eventually become something magnificent and unignorable. She was drinking her second cup when the door opened without a knock. Gerald, her stepson, walked in the way he always walked in, like the house was already his, and she was the visitor. He was 52, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of expensive casual clothing that costs more than it pretends to. Behind him came his wife Nadine, carrying a leather folder and wearing an expression Ruth had learned to recognize over the years. The expression of someone who has already made a decision and is arriving to deliver it rather than discuss it. "Ruth, we need to talk," Gerald said, sitting down without being invited. Ruth set her coffee cup down carefully. "Good morning, Gerald. Nadine." Nadine didn't sit. She opened her leather folder and placed a document on the table. Ruth looked at it without touching it. Several pages, dense text, official-looking header at the top. She recognized the name of an attorney's office. "We've decided to sell the house," Gerald said. "We've been going back and forth on it for a while, but with the market the way it is right now, it doesn't make financial sense to keep holding on to it. There's a buyer already, actually, a developer who wants the lot. They're planning to tear it down and build condominiums." Ruth looked at him steadily. "This is my home, Gerald." "Technically," Nadine said, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone who has rehearsed their lines, "technically it's Gerald's home. Franklin left it to Gerald in the will, along with the rest of the estate. You've been living here as Gerald's guest for the past 4 years. That's been very generous of him, honestly. Most people wouldn't have been so accommodating." Ruth remembered the will reading 4 years ago with perfect clarity. Franklin's attorney had read it in a conference room downtown, and she had sat there listening to her husband of 47 years leave everything to his son from his first marriage. The house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, everything except Ruth's personal belongings, and a bank account containing $23,000, which Franklin had described in the will as sufficient for Ruth's immediate needs, given that she will continue to reside at Sycamore Drive as long as she chooses. She had not fought it, because fighting it would have meant acknowledging that Franklin had done it, and some part of her had spent 4 years still refusing to fully believe it. She had loved Franklin Caldwell completely. She had nursed him through 2 years of declining health with a devotion so total that she had barely slept for the last 6 months of his life. And he had left her, legally and deliberately, with almost nothing. She had stayed in the house because it was the only home she had. Because at 71 years old with $23,000 and no income and no career and no family of her own, the alternative to staying was a question she couldn't answer. Gerald had never once asked her to leave. He'd visited occasionally, checked that things were maintained, and she had assumed, with the particular hope of someone who has nowhere else to put their hope, that the arrangement was indefinite. "How much time do I have?" she asked. Gerald at least had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. 30 days. The buyer wants to move quickly. We've already signed the preliminary agreements. There are movers we can recommend if you need help with your things." 30 days, Ruth repeated. "We think that's more than fair," Nadine said. "And honestly, Ruth, at your age, a smaller place might actually be easier to manage. Have you looked into those senior living communities? Some of them are really quite nice. They have activities and medical staff on site, which makes sense when you think about it practically." Ruth looked at Nadine for a long moment. Nadine, who had been married to Gerald for 14 years, and had never once in those 14 years asked Ruth a single question about her life before Franklin, who had always treated her with the particular politeness reserved for people you consider irrelevant. "Thank you for letting me know," Ruth said. She stood, picked up her coffee cup, rinsed it at the sink, and went to her bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed in the morning light and breathed slowly, the way her doctor had taught her when her blood pressure got too high. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. She did this 8 times. Then she opened the drawer of her nightstand and took out a small leather notebook. It had been given to her by her mother decades ago, a woman who had raised Ruth alone through genuine hardship and who had believed fiercely that a woman should always write down the things that matter most so she cannot convince herself later that they didn't happen. Ruth had kept that habit her entire life. She opened to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote 30 days. She underlined it twice. Then she wrote below it, "Figure out what Franklin actually left you." Because Ruth Eleanor Caldwell had a secret that not even Gerald knew about. A month before Franklin died, during one of the long nights when his pain was managed but his mind was still clear, he had pressed a small brass key into her palm and closed her fingers around it. He had looked at her with eyes that held something she hadn't been able to name at the time, something between guilt and determination. "There's a safe deposit box," he had whispered, "at Millfield Savings on Canton Street. The key is yours. Don't open it until after everything is settled. Wait until the dust has completely settled. Promise me." She had promised, not understanding, and then he had slept, and 2 weeks later he was gone, and she had put the key in her nightstand drawer and not touched it. She had waited, the way Franklin had asked, while Gerald assumed control, and the will was read, and the months passed into years. She had told herself she was honoring Franklin's request. The truth was that she had been afraid of what the box might contain, afraid it might be nothing, afraid that opening it would close the last door between her and having to completely accept what Franklin had done. But she was 75 years old, and she had 30 days, and she was done being afraid. She got dressed, put the key in her purse, and drove to Millfield Savings Bank on Canton Street. The safe deposit box was registered in her name only. The young bank manager confirmed this with quiet efficiency and led her to the private viewing room without any fuss. Ruth sat alone at the small table and opened the box with Franklin's key. Inside was an envelope, thick and cream-colored, sealed with tape rather than wax. Franklin's handwriting on the front read simply, "For Ruth. Everything she needs to know." Beneath the envelope was a folded document, official and stamped, that turned out to be a property deed. Ruth unfolded it with hands that trembled only slightly and read it twice to make sure she understood. A property on Millfield Road in the town of Claremont, 2 hours north. 12 acres, a farmhouse described as fully renovated, and 3 outbuildings. The deed listed the owner as Ruth Eleanor Caldwell, transferred as a gift from Franklin James Caldwell in the year 2019, 5 years before his death. 5 years before his death, before the will, before the decline. When Franklin was still healthy and clear-minded and deliberate. Ruth set the deed down and opened the envelope. "My dearest Ruth," it began, and she had to stop and press her hand flat on the table and breathe before she could continue. "If you're reading this, you finally opened the box, which means the dust has settled the way I asked you to wait for, and you're ready to understand what I've done and why I did it. I owe you an explanation that I was too much of a coward to give you while I was alive, and I'm deeply sorry for that cowardice. You deserved better from me in so many ways that I don't know where to begin, so I'll begin with the truth. I knew what my will said. I wrote it exactly the way I wrote it on purpose. Gerald has spent years with attorneys of his own, watching and waiting, looking for any way to challenge decisions I made that didn't favor him. If I had left you the house and the accounts openly, he would have contested the will on grounds of diminished capacity, on undue influence, on anything his lawyers could construct. He had told me as much, more than once, in the particular careful language of someone who wants you to know they're threatening you without actually saying so. He's been watching me and watching you for years, trying to find grounds to claim that you somehow manipulated me. So I gave him exactly what he was watching for. I gave him the will he expected, the one that proved I was a traditional man who left things to his son. I let him believe he had won. But I had been planning for you long before he started watching. The property in Claremont has been in your name for 5 years. It was transferred as a completed gift before any question of my estate could touch it. It cannot be claimed by Gerald. It cannot be contested as part of the will because it was never part of the will. It belongs to you completely and legally, and has since 2019, and any attorney you consult will confirm this immediately. The farmhouse has been fully renovated. I hired a contractor from outside the area, someone Gerald would never know, and the work was completed 3 years ago. New roof, new plumbing, new heating system, the kitchen restored with everything you would want. I paid for it all from accounts Gerald didn't know I had, accounts I opened before our marriage and maintained separately precisely because I always knew he would be watching. The property taxes are paid through a trust that will cover them for the next 30 years. You will never have to worry about losing it for failure to pay. I also want you to know that the accounts Gerald inherited are not as straightforward as he believes they are. I worked with Marcus Bellows at the law firm of Bellows and Crane. Marcus knows everything and has been waiting for you to contact him. Please call him as soon as you read this. There are things built into the structure of Gerald's inheritance that he does not yet understand. Conditions and restrictions that will make accessing that money considerably more complicated than he expects. I didn't do this out of cruelty toward Gerald. I did it because I spent 47 years watching a man who never learned that you earn a life. You don't simply receive it. What he inherited will require him to become someone better in order to access it. That may be the most useful gift I could have given him. But you, my Ruth, you I gave freedom. I know what these 4 years have been like for you. I know what it cost you to stay quiet and stay in that house and trust me when I gave you nothing visible to trust. I am sorry for every one of those days. I was weak when I should have been stronger, and I protected my plan when I should have protected your dignity. But I protected the plan because the plan was for you, and I needed it to work. The farmhouse is called Elderbrook. The people in Claremont know about you. I visited regularly, and I told them that my wife would come someday, that she was the kind of woman who made every space better simply by being in it. I hope that's still true. I believe it always will be. Go to Claremont, go to Elderbrook, build whatever life you want in the time you have remaining. You have more time and more strength than anyone has ever given you credit for, and I include myself in that failure of recognition. You were always the bravest person in every room you entered. You just never knew it because you were too busy making sure everyone else was comfortable. I love you beyond my ability to say it adequately. I always did. Forever yours, Franklin. Ruth sat in the small room of the bank for a long time after she finished reading. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. She could hear the muffled sounds of ordinary bank business happening on the other side of the door. She read the letter twice more, slowly, making sure she hadn't misunderstood anything. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope and the deed back in the safe deposit box, and wrote down the name, Marcus Bellows, and the firm Bellows and Crane in her leather notebook. She called Marcus Bellows from her car in the parking lot. He answered on the second ring as if he had been expecting her call, which she realized he had. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said warmly, "I've been hoping to hear from you. Are you somewhere you can talk?" She was. He talked for 20 minutes, and every minute changed something in her understanding of what Franklin had arranged. The property in Claremont was exactly as described, fully hers, legally airtight, transferred and recorded years before Franklin's death, with documentation that would withstand any challenge Gerald could mount. The trust covering property taxes was structured through a separate entity that Gerald had no access to or visibility into. As for Gerald's inheritance, Marcus explained it with quiet precision. The accounts Franklin had left his son were structured as conditional trusts with access restrictions that Gerald's attorneys had apparently not yet discovered in the fine print. Access to the funds required Gerald to pass annual financial responsibility evaluations conducted by an independent trustee, a retired federal judge Marcus had selected personally. Any attempt to access principal beyond a limited annual amount would trigger automatic review. The investment accounts were tied to a management structure requiring Gerald's direct active oversight. If he failed to maintain that oversight, the accounts would automatically redirect their distributions to a list of charitable organizations Franklin had designated. "And the house on Sycamore Drive," Marcus continued, "which Gerald is currently planning to sell to a developer, has a conservation easement attached to the deed that Franklin placed there 8 years ago. Any demolition or significant structural change requires approval from a historical and environmental review board, a process that typically takes between 18 months and 3 years. The developer Gerald has signed preliminary agreements with almost certainly doesn't know about this yet. When they find out, and they will find out very soon, the sale is going to become significantly more complicated." Ruth looked through her windshield at the ordinary street outside the bank. A woman was walking a dog. A man was carrying groceries. The world was going about its business with complete indifference to the fact that Ruth Eleanor Caldwell's life had just turned completely inside out. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Marcus told her. She wrote everything down in her notebook. That evening, Ruth cooked dinner in the kitchen of the house on Sycamore Drive, for what she quietly understood would be one of the last times. She made the lamb stew she had always made when she needed to think. The recipe her mother had taught her, the one that required patience and couldn't be rushed. While the stew simmered, she walked through the house slowly, room by room, not with sadness exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who is consciously closing a chapter. She looked at each room honestly, perhaps for the first time, seeing it not as the home she had built with Franklin, but as the space she had been allowed to occupy temporarily at someone else's convenience. The guest bedroom she had decorated carefully in case anyone ever visited, though no one ever did. The sitting room where Franklin had watched television every evening while she sat beside him and read, comfortable in each other's company the way long-married people become. The garden she'd planted and maintained for 3 decades, her roses and her vegetable beds, and the climbing hydrangea along the back fence that had taken 10 years to really establish itself. She would miss the garden most, she thought. Not the house. The garden. She went to bed early and slept better than she had in 4 years. The next morning she called her neighbor Patricia, who had been her closest friend since they'd both moved onto Sycamore Drive within the same year back in the early 90s. Patricia came over for coffee and Ruth told her everything, watching Patricia's face move through shock and outrage, and then, as Ruth described Claremont and Elderbrook and the deed that had been in her name for 5 years, something that looked like fierce, protective joy. "That man," Patricia said, meaning Franklin, "was either a genius or a fool or possibly both. But it sounds like he loved you in the most complicated possible way." "It was complicated," Ruth agreed. "It was also enough." Patricia helped her begin sorting through her belongings over the following days, the two of them working quietly and efficiently through decades of accumulated life. Ruth found herself surprisingly ruthless. Things she had kept out of habit or obligation went into boxes for donation. Things that were genuinely hers, objects that held real memory and meaning, those she packed carefully. She wasn't taking much. The farmhouse in Claremont was furnished, and she found that she wanted to start fresh more than she wanted to carry the past with her. She would take her mother's china and her books, and her garden tools, and her photographs, and her leather notebooks going back decades. Everything else could stay or go. On day 10 of her 30 days, Gerald arrived unannounced again, this time alone, to check on the progress of her packing. He walked through the house with his phone out, apparently making notes, and paused when he saw how much she'd already sorted. "You're further along than I expected," he said, sounding almost surprised. "Where are you planning to go?" Ruth looked at him with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. "I have somewhere to go, Gerald. I'll be out well before your deadline." He nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable in the way people do when something goes more smoothly than they'd prepared for. He'd clearly anticipated resistance, arguments, possibly tears. Her composure confused him. "Good," he said. "That's good. I'm glad it's working out." "There's something you should probably know," Ruth said, because she had decided that she would tell him about the conservation easement. Not to wound him, but because it was the right thing to do, and because she was done with silence as a strategy. "Your developer is going to run into some complications with the property," she said. "Your father placed a conservation easement on the deed 8 years ago. Any demolition or major structural change needs review board approval. It typically takes at least 18 months. You may want to have your attorneys look into it before things go further with the sale." Gerald stared at her. "What?" She gave him Marcus Bellow's name and number. "You can call Franklin's attorney. He'll explain everything. I'd recommend doing it sooner rather than later." She went back to her packing. She heard Gerald on the phone in the hallway, his voice getting louder in direct proportion to how much he was learning. She folded a sweater and put it in a box and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. On the morning of the 15th day, Ruth loaded the last of her boxes into the car she had borrowed from Patricia, who had also arranged her nephew with a small truck for the larger items. It was early, just past 7, the light thin and gray. The oak tree in the backyard was perfectly still. Ruth stood under it for a moment and put her hand on the bark the way she had many times over 30 years, feeling the solidity of it, the absolute patience of something that grows without hurrying. Then she got in her car and drove north toward Claremont. The town of Claremont materialized out of the morning mist like something from a book she might have read as a girl. It sat in a river valley between two lines of forested hills, modest and unhurried, the kind of place that didn't need to announce itself because it had nothing to prove. A main street with a hardware store and a bakery and a small library and a post office. An old covered bridge at the edge of town that looked like it had been standing since before anyone currently alive had been born. Church steeples rising above the trees. A farmer's market in the town square that was apparently in its final weeks of the season, with maybe a dozen stalls still operating. Ruth drove slowly, following the directions Marcus had sent her, and noticed what she had noticed the last time she'd driven slowly through an unfamiliar small town. People looked, but they looked with interest, not suspicion. Millfield Road wound out of town and up a gentle hill through maple trees that had gone full autumn crimson and gold. Ruth's GPS announced her destination a quarter-mile before she saw it, and when the farmhouse came into view through the trees, she stopped the car in the road and simply looked at it. It was not what she had expected, though she realized she hadn't known what to expect. The farmhouse was white clapboard, with a deep front porch running the full width of the house, black shutters on every window, a standing seam metal roof in a dark green that made the whole structure look rooted and permanent. The yard was overgrown in a way that any gardener would immediately recognize as not quite abandoned, a garden that had been planted with intention and then left to find its own way for a season or two. She could see the bones of real design underneath the wildness, stone walls delineating beds, a kitchen garden area gone to seed but clearly once producing, an orchard of maybe a dozen apple trees, unpruned but still heavy with fruit. The three outbuildings Franklin had mentioned were arranged at the back of the property. A barn, large and structurally solid-looking with newish red paint. A smaller building that might have been a workshop. A third structure she couldn't quite identify from the road. Ruth pulled into the gravel drive and sat for a moment. Then she got out of the car and walked to the front porch and took out the brass key Franklin had pressed into her palm on one of the last nights of his life. The lock turned smoothly, easily. The lock of a door that has been maintained. She stepped inside. The renovation was everything Marcus had described and more. Wide pine floors refinished to a warm honey color. A stone fireplace in the main room large enough to stand in, its mantel a single piece of barn beam. The kitchen had been expanded and fitted with farmhouse-appropriate details, deep sinks and open shelving, and a proper pantry, and a wood-burning cook stove alongside a modern range. The ceilings throughout were low and beamed in the original style, and every window had been replaced with double-paned glass that kept the historical look while actually keeping out the cold. The furniture was simple and clearly chosen with care. A long pine table in the dining area, comfortable chairs in natural fabrics, bookshelves built into the walls of what was clearly intended as a reading room or study, good rugs on the floors, lamps positioned in the places where a person actually wants light. And throughout the house, in ways both obvious and subtle, evidence of Franklin's thinking about her specifically. The reading room bookshelves were empty, waiting for books rather than displaying someone else's collection. The kitchen garden tools hanging in the back entry were new and high quality, the kind a serious gardener would choose. The potting bench in the smaller outbuilding, which she discovered within the first hour, was built exactly the right height for someone her stature. He had measured. He had thought about it. He had built things to fit her. On the kitchen table, placed where it could not be missed, was an envelope with her name on it. Inside was a handwritten note from someone she didn't know, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who described herself as Franklin's contact in Claremont, the person he had asked to look after the property and to make sure the house was ready when Ruth arrived. The note said that Eleanor would come by that afternoon if Ruth was willing, and that she'd brought food to stock the pantry. It also said, with simple directness, "Franklin talked about you every time he came. We've been looking forward to meeting you for a long time." Ruth set the note down and stood in her kitchen, in her house, on her 12 acres, and felt something happening in her chest that took her a moment to identify. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was not grief, though grief was present too. It was something more fundamental than either. It was the sensation of landing, of arriving somewhere after a very long journey, of a door opening into a room that had been prepared for you, specifically, not for a general idea of a person, but for you, your height and your habits and your taste, and your love of gardens, and your need for a proper reading room, and your preference for functional tools over decorative ones. She stood in the kitchen of Elderbrook Farm and understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that she had been loved. Imperfectly, and at great personal cost to her dignity, and with more complexity than she would have chosen. But genuinely and specifically, and with the kind of sustained intention that doesn't burn hot and bright and then disappear, but instead burns low and steady for 47 years. She put the kettle on. Eleanor Marsh arrived at 3 in the afternoon, carrying 2 bags of groceries and accompanied by an older man she introduced as her husband Robert and a younger woman named Diane, who apparently ran the local farmer's market and had been the person keeping the kitchen garden from completely reverting to wilderness. They were matter-of-fact in their welcome, the way people are in small towns where warmth is expressed through action rather than performance. Eleanor showed her how the wood-burning cook stove worked. Robert walked her around the property and explained the condition of each building with practical, useful detail. Diane gave her a rundown of what had been planted in the kitchen garden and what could still be salvaged this season and what she'd recommend replanting in spring. He came about every 6 weeks, Eleanor said at one point when they were sitting at the kitchen table with tea. For years. He'd do a walkthrough, make notes about what needed attention, sometimes just sit on the porch for a while. He told us he was getting the place ready for his wife. He said she'd had a long wait and he wanted it to be worth it. Ruth wrapped her hands around her tea mug. Did he say anything else about me? Eleanor smiled. He said you were the most patient person he'd ever known, and that he was never entirely sure whether that was a virtue or a tragedy. He said he hoped it was a virtue. That sounds like Franklin, Ruth said. He also said you could grow anything, that your gardens were the most beautiful he'd ever seen, and that the property needed you almost as much as you needed it. Ruth looked out the kitchen window at the overgrown beds in the fading afternoon light, already thinking about what she'd do with them. Which roses, where to put the vegetable garden, whether the orchard could be brought back to real productivity with proper pruning, or whether some of the trees were too far gone. A project, she thought. A real one. Hers. Over the following weeks, the town of Claremont introduced itself to Ruth in the gradual, unpressured way of a place that has seen people arrive and is willing to wait and see who they turn out to be. The hardware store owner, a man named Carl who seemed to know the function of every object ever made, helped her identify what tools she'd need for the garden restoration and didn't overcharge her or underestimate her knowledge. The woman who ran the bakery, whose name was Joan and who had apparently known Eleanor for 40 years, began setting aside a particular rye bread Ruth had mentioned she liked without being asked. The library, small but surprisingly well-stocked, had a gardening section that Ruth fell into with the enthusiasm of someone who has been keeping that part of herself waiting for too long. She joined a Tuesday morning group of women who met at the library ostensibly to discuss books, but actually to discuss everything. They ranged in age from their late 40s to one woman, Agnes, who was 84 and had opinions about everything, and stated them without apology. Ruth found that she fit among them without effort, that her years of being quiet in rooms had given her an unusually good ear, and that people appreciated being listened to with real attention. She planted garlic in October because garlic needs cold to be planted properly, and Ruth believed in doing things the way they needed to be done. She pruned the apple trees aggressively, knowing they might not produce well the following year, but they would produce properly the year after. She identified which rose bushes were worth saving, and which had gone too woody and too diseased, and she cut those back without sentimentality because a garden requires honesty. She called Marcus Bellows every few weeks to stay informed about the situation with Gerald. The conservation easement had indeed created serious complications with the developer Gerald had engaged. The preliminary sale agreement had been suspended while the developer's attorneys assessed the timeline and cost implications of the required review process. Gerald was apparently furious, though his fury was directed at the review board and at his own attorneys rather than at Ruth, which was as it should be. The trust restrictions on his inherited accounts had also begun making themselves felt as Gerald tried to access larger sums and ran into the conditions Franklin had built in. The character evaluation requirement in particular was proving challenging for reasons Marcus described with professional neutrality. Ruth felt no satisfaction in Gerald's difficulties. She had thought she might, but the truth was that once she was at Elderbrook, once she was in her garden with dirt on her hands and her own kitchen smelling of whatever she'd decided to cook, Gerald and Nadine and the house on Sycamore Drive were part of a life that felt genuinely over. Not a wound anymore, just a chapter that had been long and sometimes painful and was now complete. She was occasionally angry. She was honest with herself about that. There were mornings when she'd think about the 4 years she'd spent in that house waiting, the 4 years of uncertainty and quiet humiliation, of being treated as a tolerated presence in her own home, and she'd feel a flash of hot, clean anger. Not at Franklin, not anymore. More at the circumstances that had required such elaborate secrecy. At a world where a woman with 47 years of devoted marriage behind her could be reduced to legal guest status in her own house, with no recourse and no voice. She talked about this one Tuesday morning with the library group, not specifically but in general, about what it means to be a woman of a certain age and a certain era, raised to be quiet and accommodating and to let others take up space. Agnes, who was 84 and had not been quiet a day in her life, listened carefully and then said, "The thing about the quiet ones is that when they finally decide to make noise, the sound carries twice as far. Because nobody expected it." Agnes had a way of saying things that Ruth wrote down in her notebook afterward. In November, Ruth received a letter from Gerald. She opened it at her kitchen table with her morning coffee, reading it twice the way she'd read Franklin's letter at the bank, making sure she understood. It was not an apology, exactly. Gerald was not a man who apologized easily, or perhaps at all. But it was something adjacent to an apology, a letter of a man who was beginning to understand that his father had been considerably more deliberate and more complex than he had assumed, and who was perhaps also beginning to understand something about the woman his father had married. He wrote that his attorneys had confirmed the legal situation with the Claremont property, and that he had no intentions of challenging her ownership. He wrote that the sale of the Sycamore Drive property had been restructured with a buyer who was interested in restoration rather than demolition, which he seemed to believe would have pleased his father, and which Ruth privately agreed it would have. He wrote one sentence near the end that she read 3 times. "I think my father may have been wiser about some things than I gave him credit for." Ruth wrote back, briefly and without warmth, but also without hostility. She thanked him for the update on the house. She wished him well with his affairs. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that wisdom comes in forms we don't recognize while we're too busy trying to take what we believe is ours, and that the most important lessons tend to arrive after the most expensive mistakes. She didn't say it because she was learning that some truths are better kept in notebooks than delivered to people who haven't yet earned them. She did say, because she believed it, "Your father was one of the most complicated men I ever knew. I spent a long time being angry with him, and I expect I'll continue working through that anger for some time. But I also know he loved me in the most thorough and patient and sustained way I have ever been loved. I'm choosing to hold both of those things at once. You might consider doing the same." She sealed the envelope and drove to the post office, where the postmaster, a man named George, who knew everyone's name, asked if she was settling in all right and seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "I think I am," she said, and realized she meant it completely. By the time the first real snow came in December, Elderbrook Farm had become home in the truest sense, the kind that isn't about the physical space, but about who you are inside it. Ruth knew where the drafty spots were and had addressed them. She knew which burner on the modern range ran hot and which ran cool. She knew that the barn cats, 2 of them, gray and white respectively, who apparently came with the property and had been maintained by Eleanor while the house was unoccupied, preferred their food at 7 in the morning and would remind her loudly if she was late. She knew the sound the wind made in the maples when a real storm was coming versus when it was just passing through. She also knew her neighbors. Not in the managed social way she had known Franklin's colleagues in Boston, the careful acquaintances of people performing a particular version of themselves for each other. She knew them in the way of people who share a place and show up for each other without agenda. Eleanor, who came for tea on Thursday afternoons. Robert, who had helped her address the sagging floor of the potting shed without being asked. Diane, who texted her on market days to let her know if something she'd been looking for had turned up at one of the stalls. Agnes from the library group, who had apparently decided that Ruth was worth knowing and who phoned on Wednesday evenings to report on anything interesting that had happened that week. The reading room, which Ruth had initially felt almost shy about using, became the room she spent most of her evenings in. She'd built up a fire in the small fireplace Franklin had installed specifically in that room, she suspected specifically for this purpose, and she'd read for hours with a lamp pulled close and the 2 barn cats arranged on the furniture around her, with the proprietary comfort of animals who have always been home. She read differently than she had before, with more patience, more willingness to stop and think about what she'd read, less of the guilty rush of someone reading in the hours between everyone else's needs. She read philosophy and natural history and poetry and thick novels she'd been meaning to read for decades. She reread books she'd loved when young and found they'd become different books because she was a different reader. She began writing things down in her notebooks, not just events and lists and things to remember, but actual thoughts, observations about the garden and the seasons and what it felt like to be 75, and learning something new every day. She wasn't sure why she was writing these things down, or for whom. Maybe just for herself. Maybe because her mother had believed in recording things that matter, and it turned out that quite a lot of things mattered. In January, she drove to Boston for a single day to handle some remaining paperwork with Marcus Bellows. She had lunch with Patricia, who was continuing to be furious on her behalf in a loyal and energizing way. She drove past the house on Sycamore Drive but didn't stop. It looked the same from outside, the oak tree bare and enormous against the winter sky. She felt, looking at it from the car, almost nothing, which was its own kind of answer about whether she had made the right choice in leaving when she did, rather than fighting to stay. She was back in Claremont by evening. Spring arrived in April with the slow insistence of something that has been waiting patiently and is finally done waiting. Ruth was in the garden every day, sometimes for hours, working through the restoration she had been planning since October, with the focused pleasure of someone doing exactly what they are meant to be doing. The garlic she'd planted in fall came up in perfect rows. She cleared and rebuilt the kitchen garden beds with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, because she believed that if you're going to garden, you should garden properly. She pruned the roses hard and watched with satisfaction as they responded by putting out vigorous new growth. She planted a cutting garden in the south-facing bed by the barn, because she had always wanted a cutting garden and had never had one, and there was no longer any reason to postpone the things she wanted. Diane from the farmer's market began consulting her informally about some of the growing questions that came up at the market. Growers who were struggling with particular problems, soil issues, pest management, plant diseases. Ruth had been gardening seriously for 40 years and had read widely and paid attention carefully, and she found that she knew things she hadn't realized she knew until someone asked. She began appearing at the market occasionally, not selling anything, just present, and people started seeking her out specifically. Agnes told her at the library group one Tuesday, "You're becoming a resource. That's the best thing a person can be in a small place." A resource. Ruth had not expected, at 75, to become a resource. She had expected, if she was honest, to become quieter, to retire further into herself, which she had assumed was the appropriate direction for a woman her age with nothing built of her own. Instead, she found herself more present, more engaged, more interested in the world and the people in it than she had been in decades. The silence she had maintained for so long had not been her nature. She was understanding. It had been her accommodation. And now that she had stopped accommodating, she was discovering the self that had been waiting underneath. She was not finished grieving Franklin. She thought she probably wouldn't ever be entirely finished, and she had made a kind of peace with that. Grief, she was learning, is not a problem to be solved or a task to be completed. It lives with you and changes shape over time. Some mornings she woke and the first thing she felt was missing him, with a physical acuteness that took her breath away. Other days she felt a quieter and more complicated mix of love and anger and understanding, the complicated cocktail of feeling about someone who loved you genuinely while also failing you in specific and consequential ways. She talked about this with Eleanor one Thursday afternoon, the first time she'd tried to articulate it to anyone. "I think people want grief to be simple," Eleanor said. "They want you to either have been happy and now be devastated, or to have been unhappy and now be relieved. They don't want both at once because it's harder to respond to." Ruth thought about that. Then she said, "He gave me everything he could and withheld the things I needed most from him, and both of those things were completely true at the same time. And I loved him, and he frustrated me to my core, and I'm grateful and I'm angry and I'm at peace. All of that, simultaneously." "That sounds about right," Eleanor said. "That sounds like a marriage." The summer came in warm and abundant. Ruth's kitchen garden produced more than she could use, and she began giving vegetables away at the library group, and to neighbors, and to the farmer's market where Diane found willing homes for anything Ruth brought. The cutting garden exceeded her hopes, and she had flowers in every room and brought bunches to anyone who would take them. She baked bread on Saturdays the way her mother had, the house filling with that particular smell that is comfort made into something physical. She drove to Boston once more in late August to attend to some financial matters and to have dinner with Patricia, who was planning to visit Claremont in September and who had been following the ongoing saga of Gerald's trust complications with the devoted attention of someone who has found a soap opera she believes she personally deserves. Gerald was managing, apparently, adapting to the conditions and restrictions more successfully than he had initially. Whether this constituted the character growth Franklin had designed the trust to encourage, Ruth couldn't say with certainty. She hoped so. She bore him no specific ill will. She simply required that he leave her alone, and he had. The house on Sycamore Drive had sold in the spring to a family with young children who, according to Gerald's letter, intended to restore rather than renovate, which Ruth understood to mean they would keep it fundamentally what it was, rather than turning it into something different. She was glad. She thought about the oak tree and hoped the children would be allowed to climb it. On an evening in early September, Ruth sat on the front porch of Elderbrook Farm and watched the light change across the hills. The maples were beginning to show their first suggestions of color. The garden was full and producing. One of the barn cats was asleep on the porch railing with the conviction of an animal who has never once doubted its right to occupy any space it chose. Ruth thought about the woman she had been at 28, who had walked into the office where she worked and met a man named Franklin Caldwell and understood almost immediately that she was going to love him, whether that was wise or not. She thought about the 47 years between that woman and this one, all the silence and the accommodation and the patience, all the meals and gardens and careful management of other people's comfort, all the rooms she had entered and made better without anyone noticing she was the one making them better. And she thought about the 30 days. The morning Gerald and Nadine had walked into her kitchen without knocking, carrying a leather folder and a timeline, and their expectation that she would receive the news the way she had received everything, quietly and without making a scene. She had not made a scene. She had driven to a bank and opened a box and read a letter and made a phone call. She had packed 3 decades of life into the back of a borrowed truck and driven north toward a house she'd never seen, toward a town she'd never visited, toward a future that had been waiting for her to claim it. She had done all of this without drama and without a scene, but also without asking anyone's permission. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she had moved through the world as if she had the right to be in it on her own terms. Justice, she thought, looking at the hills. It doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always arrive in the form you expected or through the channels you planned. Sometimes it's been building quietly for years in the back of someone else's plan, waiting for you to be ready to find it. She was 75 years old, and she had 12 acres and a farmhouse that fit her, and a community that saw her, and a garden that needed her, and approximately 30 years of notebooks full of things she'd been paying attention to. She had done the math on her situation, not financially, though that math was also fine. She meant the deeper accounting, what she had spent, what she had gained, what had been taken, and what had been given, what had been lost in the long years of silence, and what, remarkably, had been preserved. The cat opened one eye, assessed the situation, and closed it again. Ruth reached for her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Then she thought for a moment, watching the last light fade on the hills. Then she wrote, "This is the life. Not the one I expected, the one that was waiting." She underlined it once. Then she put the notebook down and watched the stars come out over Claremont, unhurried, in their own good time, which is the only time they have ever kept.